Buzu Anin Nishnakaz, Jamie Isaac, Nodem Sagin First Nation, Dudem Magwa. So I am Jamie Isaac, from a member of Sagin First Nation, and I'm of the Bear Clan. I am really honored to be showing this work at Gallery 1CO3 on Treaty 1 territory, and it is my first solo exhibition and collaboration with my family to present the colonial histories of the residential schools, to share their stories and experiences, but also to celebrate a journey of knowledge repatriation, of knowledge reclamation, and the Anishinaabe language. So, miigwech for joining me on this walk. So this work is called My Inheritance. It is a Lightbox series that I did in 2013 at a residency called Reconsidering Reconciliation. And this was in Kamloops, BC. And the artists that were invited to that residency were thinking through the apology in 2009 that the Harper administration had publicly presented, and I was at the time working for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to curate exhibitions at the inaugural event in Winnipeg, and then I started my own journey of research that I wanted to do in my own art practice. So I did these light boxes to reflect the history of the Fort Alexander Residential School that my family attended. My grandmother, my grandfather, and my mother, and uncles and aunts, of course, kin and community. So it was really important for me because when I was curating the work for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I had known this in my family, but I didn't really recognize or fully understand the full history of residential school in our Canadian history, because from a collective society that was hidden, and when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission started working with survivors to bring forth their stories, it was also a huge recognition in my family of intergenerational trauma, and this whole chapter, which is actually quite a long chapter of colonialism in Canada, and the impacts that are happening today. So the wood that I used for this is reclaimed wood, and I live in a house that was built in 1883, and I found this wood in my backyard, and it was the same green actually that was the trim on the residential school and much of the architecture at the time. You'll also see that with the St. Boniface Museum. And so I wanted to reclaim this wood to act as the frames for the windows of these light boxes. And they serve a purpose because of their archival materiality, but serves as a window to this history, and those that approach the work can see this through historical material of this wood, of the color, but also the archival photos that I researched from Canada Archives. And these archives are no longer available online. They're very, very hard to research now. And after the Harper administration, it was very hard for survivors and intergenerational survivors to access that knowledge. So I feel that in many ways it's a further erasure of Indigenous presence and of Indigenous history. So this project really served the purpose of illuminating and bringing to light this history, my family's history, and it honors the survivors of residential schools, but also intergenerational survivors. So I've put the tobacco ties here, and I am encouraged by my family to be able to share this history through my artistic and curatorial practice in story. This is actually a picture of my Nana, and I know that when I'm here with my Nana, she can also identify the people in some of the photos. And I think it's really important to be able to bring forth these stories, to continue to tell this history and address the erasure of Indigenous experience in Canada. So this work is actually a work that I did in 2014, and it was in conjunction with a program that I was working with Video Pool, a media arts fund, to create a film. And so I created a film called Burning an Effigy, and that was to address intergenerational grief, intergenerational anger, and loss of culture. And so I worked with an architectural student to use the archival information that I found on the blueprints of the residential school to create a model. And the Fort Alexander Residential School is no longer there. It was demolished by the chief and council at the time to work with the community to demolish the school. So in a way, this serves as an archive, and that iteration was to project the film onto the school, and the school was a screen. But for this iteration and this exhibition Brings to Light, I wanted to present it as a shadow box. And so I've put light inside the residential school, and that projects the light from inside, creating a shadow box of many schools, of many institutional structures, and casting a shadow larger than itself, larger than the model itself. So it also creates this idea of many windows, and I have my Nana's recording of her story of attending the residential school and finding the one window that she looked through as an act of resilience, an act of resistance to be able to access her home, because that was the one window that she could look out and see her house, see her parents outside chopping wood, hanging laundry. She could see the chimney smoking. And so for her, that brought her comfort every day. And it was her daily act of resistance, of oppression in these spaces on children, to be able to bring a small amount of comfort. But I can't even imagine how that would feel, being so close to home and not being able to go home. And she presents a story that is of many survivors, being close to home or so far away from home, and it not being able to bring comfort to be able to go home and see your parents. So these schools really cast a huge shadow on our history, and the taking away, these colonial structures took away culture, they took away language, they took away family connection and community connection. And so these works together shed light, they bring light to this history, and the idea is that when people come away from this exhibition and this work, they can also think about their connections to family, their connections to their culture, and or disconnect. And so I think everyone has their story of intergenerational trauma, intergenerational resiliency, and that artwork can really bring about dialogue and really internal listening and thinking about that connection in their own lives. So this work really is about knowledge repatriation. And I think about when people write in repetition on the wall, it's usually about, I will not. And this is actually, we will learn the Anishinaabe language. And doing something in repetition is a methodology in remembering. And so this work actually asks people to think about that in their own journey of repatriating knowledge, repatriating language, and the intro into gaining language, gaining culture. And culture is best expressed through the language, as my Nana has said. And this portion actually asks the audiences to look through the pocket Ojibwe for kids and parents and find something, find a phrase, find a word that resonates with them, and for them to write on the wall. And from my knowledge, for the duration of the exhibition, it's been erased and then people add on, and so they can take part and it becomes immersive for their own learning in this exhibition. This is why we put the residential school desk. And actually, my father had found this on an auction, and when my mom came to my place and saw this, she said, "Oh my gosh, that looks exactly like the desks that we had in residential school." So bringing it into this installation provides a new way of thinking about how we approach knowledge and the knowledge repatriation, bringing back what was lost. And so when I did this work, this is called knowledge as territory. And when we think about the idea of land back, we can also attribute this to knowledge repatriation, bringing back Indigenous knowledge. And this first panel is translated to bringing back Indigenous knowledge. And so I think about the idea of land back. Well, land in this iteration is knowledge, and so these are knowledge as territory. And in standing in tension to the colonial structures of the residential school, I wanted to create, give reference to the teepee. And so these panels here are a photo collage, and it's a photo that I took inside a teepee that my auntie and uncle had. And this pattern here is actually weathered from mildew, from smoke, from really just being exposed to the land and to the weather. And so it created this sort of painterly look that I think some have attributed their connection to the land in thinking about lichen on rocks or bark on a tree and birch. And these wooden panels, all four of them, are actually on birch wood. And they each have these kind of shapes on all of them to represent the moon cycles and the sun rising. So they are all studded as well with magnets. And they're opposing one another. So when you move it, it moves the other. And this can be thought of gaining access to knowledge and the trials of learning and relearning and reclaiming, repatriating knowledge that was not lost, but was suppressed through the colonial systems. And so it does take a while, and it does take action to be able to bring this back, to practice it, and to reclaim it. So that's what it means when you're physically touching and physically moving this, is that it takes participatory action for this knowledge to be gained. This panel is representative of the Thunderbird. And the Thunderbird in many nations across Turtle Island is represented as strength and courage. And it also represents sort of indigenous epistemology and connection to the unknown and the spirit world. They're wonderfully spun by bearings, bones reds that are used in skateboarding. And there's a really good brand of skateboarding bearings. And behind, to keep everything balanced, is actually skateboard wheels. And this idea of perpetual movement, of mobilizing knowledge. This panel represents the land. You have to come close to see it, but it's all carved in and dremeled in. And I really wanted to pay homage to the actual materiality of the birch and the wood grains, because they remind me of the waterways, of the topography of the land, but also to honor the material itself and the wood grain. It's next to the panel on medicines that heal us. So we have the sage, the sweetgrass, the cedar, and the tobacco. And all of these medicines are sacred, and they're sacred in healing. The bundle of sweetgrass is held on by a hand of resistance, and that hand of resistance is a way forward, and a way forward of resisting colonial powers to be able to repatriate knowledge, to celebrate indigenous knowledge, and to embrace it into our lives and in our hearts. It's backlit by pink, because I love pink, and I also think that it has a certain energy and futurism to it. So this is about mobilizing knowledge and thinking about knowledge as territory, as we are connected to the land.